Today, we continue with Inside MS-13, the most feared women in gang history here on XityShadow. Chapter 5, Unnamed MS-13 Smuggler, Texas Case. A sobering example of how deeply gang networks can spread, even in places where few people expect them. Number 5, an unnamed female MS-13 member tied to a Texas smuggling case. In early 2023, Border Patrol agents near McAllen, Texas stopped what initially appeared to be a routine human smuggling operation along the Rio Grande. Incidents like this happen frequently in the region, where groups of migrants move through rough terrain hoping to cross into the United States undetected. But this case quickly stood out. Among the group was a woman authorities later identified as having known ties to MS-13. While officials never publicly released her name, the details they shared painted a concerning picture. According to federal records, she was a Salvadoran national with a criminal history in the United States stretching back more than a decade. She had reportedly lived in Virginia, where she was arrested in 2008 on embezzlement-related charges. On the surface, the offense may not have seemed connected to violent gang activity, but investigators later linked her to broader criminal networks associated with MS-13. When agents processed the group and ran fingerprints through federal databases, the woman's record immediately triggered alerts tied to prior immigration violations, criminal offenses, and documented gang affiliation. Authorities separated her from the group for additional questioning. Officials later confirmed she had previously been deported from the United States and was now attempting to re-enter the country. Investigators believed she may have been trying to reconnect with criminal associates operating in Texas and along parts of the East Coast, though many details surrounding the investigation were never publicly disclosed. Her arrest highlighted a growing concern among law enforcement agencies, the evolving role of women within transnational gangs like MS-13. For years, public perception of the gang focused almost entirely on heavily tattooed male members involved in street violence. But investigators say the organization relies on many different roles behind the scenes. Some female members have allegedly been involved in communication networks, recruitment, transportation logistics, and smuggling operations. Authorities have noted that individuals in these positions can sometimes avoid attention because they do not match the stereotype many people associate with organized gang activity. The Rio Grande Valley has long been considered one of the most active smuggling corridors along the southern border. Law enforcement agencies say criminal organizations often exploit the region's remote terrain to move both people and illicit activity across borders. Officials stress that cases like this are not isolated incidents. They represent the ongoing challenge of identifying individuals with connections to organized criminal groups while managing large-scale border enforcement operations. Following her arrest, the woman was transferred to ICE custody and held on immigration-related violations connected to her prior deportation history. While parts of her criminal background remained sealed, authorities confirmed she had documented ties to MS-13 and a record of previous offenses in the United States. Her story may not have generated major national headlines, but investigators viewed it as another example of how criminal organizations continue adapting over time. And sometimes, the individuals who attract the least attention can become the hardest to detect. Chapter 6, Flocka, Survivor Testimony, the woman who escaped MS-13. In the world of MS-13, leaving the gang is often considered one of the most dangerous choices a person can make. Former members who try to walk away are frequently viewed as traitors, and many spend years living in fear long after they leave. That is what makes the story of Flocka so unusual. Her real identity has never been publicly released for safety reasons, but in El Salvador she was once known by the nickname Flaca, meaning skinny. Unlike many former gang members, she survived long enough to speak anonymously about her experiences and describe what life inside the organization was like for women. Flocka grew up in a poverty-stricken neighborhood where gang activity shaped everyday life. Violence, intimidation, and recruitment were constant realities in the community around her. By the time she was a teenager, many people she knew were already connected to gangs in some way. According to her later testimony, joining MS-13 was less about status and more about survival. At first, the gang offered what seemed like protection and belonging, members told her she would be cared for and treated like family. But over time, that image faded. In anonymous interviews published years later, Flocka described an environment built on fear, control, and constant pressure. She said women inside the gang were often treated differently from male members and were expected to follow orders without question. Some female members acted as lookouts or couriers. Others were pressured into relationships with gang members or subjected to emotional and physical abuse. In one interview, she explained that gang life left her feeling trapped and powerless, saying she felt as though her identity no longer belonged to her. Over time, the violence and fear became overwhelming. Flocka eventually decided she wanted out, even though leaving could put her life at risk. She quietly distanced herself from the gang, avoided contact with former associates, and changed her daily routines in hopes of avoiding retaliation. Eventually, she sought help from a local church, one of the few places where some former gang members attempt to rebuild their lives. The church helped provide shelter, counseling, and support as she tried to start over under a new identity. But escaping physically was only part of the battle. Flocka later spoke about struggling with trauma, anxiety, and the constant fear that someone from her past might recognize her. Even years later, she said the psychological effects of gang life never fully disappeared. Despite those fears, she eventually began helping others trying to leave similar situations behind. Quietly and anonymously, she became involved in efforts to support former gang members seeking a safer path. Her story later appeared in reporting by the investigative organization Insight Crime, though her face, location, and real name remained hidden for security reasons. Most headlines focused on Lenaís Escobar, also known as La Diabla, who was accused of helping lure the victims to the location. But as investigators dug deeper, another name slowly emerged behind the scenes: 23-year-old Kelly Gomez. Unlike some of the others involved, Gomez was not publicly associated with the violent image often connected to MS-13. She was not accused of carrying out the attack herself, and early reports barely mentioned her role at all. But according to prosecutors, her involvement became clearer as investigators reviewed phone records, social media activity, witness statements, and digital communications connected to the case. Authorities alleged that Gomez helped coordinate contact between members of the clique and the victims. Prosecutors said she participated in arranging a late-night meetup presented as a harmless gathering between friends. Investigators later argued that the meeting had actually been planned as an ambush. According to court testimony, Gomez remained behind the scenes while others brought the victims to the wooded area. Prosecutors claimed she helped track movements, confirm locations, and communicate with gang members involved in the attack. When the victims arrived, several MS-13 members reportedly emerged from hiding armed with weapons. Multiple teenagers were killed, while another survived and later provided investigators with key eyewitness testimony. At first, Gomez's name did not appear prominently in media coverage or early public filings. She was not physically identified at the scene of the attack. However, as investigators pieced together digital evidence, authorities said they uncovered messages and communications tying her to the planning process. When questioned by law enforcement, Gomez reportedly denied involvement and claimed she did not know violence was going to occur. Prosecutors, however, argued the evidence suggested otherwise. Facing serious federal charges and the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, Gomez later agreed to cooperate with investigators. She testified against several co-defendants and provided details about the communications and planning connected to the case. According to prosecutors, her testimony became an important part of securing convictions against multiple individuals involved in the attack, including Escobar and other alleged MS-13 associates. Not everyone viewed her cooperation the same way. Some relatives and supporters of the victims believed her testimony was motivated more by self-preservation than remorse. Others viewed her as a young woman who had become deeply involved in a violent environment and eventually chose to cooperate once confronted with overwhelming evidence. Details surrounding her plea agreement were never fully made public, but reports indicated she avoided the most severe penalties by assisting prosecutors. Due to her status as a cooperating witness, much of her current situation remains sealed from public view. The case highlighted an important reality about how organized gangs often operate. Law enforcement officials say these organizations do not rely solely on visible enforcers or direct acts of violence. They also depend on people who can blend into everyday life, build trust, gather information, and coordinate activity without drawing attention. Investigators say women sometimes filled those roles because they were less likely to raise suspicion. Prosecutors did not accuse Gomez of physically carrying out the killings, but they argued she played a significant role in helping create the circumstances that led to the attack. And according to investigators, that behind-the-scenes involvement made her just as important to the operation as the individuals who carried out the violence directly. Chapter 8: The Black Widows Clique. MS-13 has long been associated with brutal street violence, public intimidation, and deadly rivalries. But in one of the most unusual cases linked to the gang, investigators uncovered something very different: a group of women accused of using relationships, manipulation, and financial schemes as part of organized criminal activity. They became known as Las Viudas Negras, the Black Widows. According to Salvadoran authorities and court records, the group operated quietly for years under the radar of law enforcement. Unlike traditional MS-13 cliques associated with graffiti, territorial disputes, or visible gang activity, these women allegedly focused on romance-based targeting schemes. Investigators claimed members of the group formed relationships with vulnerable men, often those who were older, isolated, or financially stable. In several cases, authorities alleged the relationships eventually led to financial exploitation and murder plots connected to gang activity. Prosecutors said the pattern was carefully planned. A woman would begin a relationship, build trust, and in some cases marry the victim. Authorities alleged that once legal or financial ties were established, gang associates would later target the husband for robbery, extortion, or murder. According to investigators, the crimes were difficult to detect because the women appeared to be living ordinary lives. They were not publicly acting like traditional gang members, and many had no obvious connection to violent street activity. One of the most widely discussed cases involved a man who had reportedly been married only a short time before he was killed. Investigators later alleged that his wife had been communicating with gang associates throughout the relationship and helping coordinate the attack behind the scenes. Authorities believe the motive was not always financial. In some cases, prosecutors argued the crimes were also tied to loyalty, status, and proving commitment to the gang. Law enforcement officials eventually linked the group to multiple killings, though investigators acknowledged the total number may never be fully known. The investigation became increasingly complex because many of the alleged participants did not fit the public stereotype of gang members. According to authorities, they blended into everyday society while quietly maintaining connections to criminal networks. Eventually, a joint effort between Salvadoran police and anti-gang investigators uncovered phone records, financial evidence, and testimony from former gang associates that prosecutors said connected several women to the crimes. In 2017, multiple arrests were made, and the alleged members of the Black Widows clique were brought to trial in a highly publicized case. Prosecutors described the women as calculated participants who weaponized personal relationships in service of organized criminal activity. They presented evidence they said showed coordination between the women and gang members during every stage of the alleged schemes, from identifying targets to arranging attacks. Defense attorneys, however, argued some of the women were being unfairly portrayed as masterminds when, according to them, they may themselves have been pressured or manipulated by more powerful male gang members within MS-13. The case sparked debate across El Salvador about coercion, organized crime, and the hidden ways gangs can operate beyond the streets. That's it for today's episode of Inside MS-13, the most feared women in gang history on XityShadow. If you found this story compelling, stay tuned for the next chapter as we continue uncovering the people, crimes, and hidden roles behind one of the most feared gangs in history.